Let's say someone says that they wanted to work with DMT. How exactly do they work with it?
With DMT, it's not orally active in and of itself.
How would that impact my life?
That's basically what the mystical experience is. It's a metaphysical one.
Our understanding of these substances, we know from just having had the conversations that we've had on this podcast, are at their very beginnings.
There's a real push now, encouragement to talk more about the challenging experiences that people have.
We're going to get into that in a lot more depth in a few minutes. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Webdelics podcast, where we're on a journey to find out the truth about plant medicines and psychedelics, get rid of the myths, and change the narrative. I'm your host, Scott Mason, and with us today is a very special guest, and one I've been looking forward to having this conversation with for quite a little while. His name is Pascal Michael. And Pascal, maybe I'll just start by asking you to tell us a little bit about who you are.
Sure. Thank you so much, Scott. Really cool to be on the Webdelics podcast. I believe a student of mine actually helped facilitate the kind of introduction with us, Lee, so shout out to Lee.
Lee, yes.
So a little intro to myself, thank you. I guess academically, in terms of like credentials and such, I started my undergraduate BSc was in neuroscience, so that's really kind of the bedrock of where I'm coming from with everything latterly, with a smidge of psychology thrown in there, and then I did a master's in clinical mental health. A lot of it was clinical psychology kind of based, and then did my doctorate on psychedelics in the psychedelic sphere, but really the key to it, the kind of central thrust was about near-death experiences and the intersection between those. And I'm currently a lecturer in psychology at the University of Greenwich in London, and I also co-run and teach an online one-year professional certificate course with the ALF Trust in transpersonal psychology.
Wow. So you're qualified to talk on the topic today. Pascal, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
The theme of the day is drawing deep insights from DMT. And this is part of a series of episodes that focus on specific substances rather than some of the issues that we discussed during an earlier iteration of the show, which focus more on cultural impacts or personal stories. This is more about understanding the differences between these substances, what they can do, what they can't do, and why they might be worthy of further exploration by anyone who is listening to or watching this podcast. So with that in mind, Pascal, let's just start with getting some factual fundamentals down. What does DMT stand for, and what is it anyway? All of these words, these acronyms and everything, they're so confusing, I can never remember. Just please break it down for me.
So DMT. Technically it's NN-DMT because you differentiate it from other similar analogous molecules like 5-MeO-DMT. And bifotinine. So these are the related chemicals, but so NN-DMT is dimethyltryptamine. So that's what that stands for.
And what is it exactly?
It's a tryptamine, particular chemical. It's a serotonergic hallucinogen, psychedelic. So that means it acts on the serotonin system. It actually can be considered as a so-called like promiscuous molecule, so it does act on a kind of a slew of neurotransmitter systems, but the way that it exerts its prototypical psychedelic effects is via the serotonin system, a particular subtype of receptor called the serotonin 2A receptor. That's the best evidence kind of suggests that's the receptor via which classical psychedelics like DMT alongside things like Psilocybin, which you'll get in magic mushrooms and things. That's how they exert that's where the psychedelic phenomenology and stuff comes from. But it's also, it's some commentators, Dennis McKenna, so that it's kind of ubiquitous in nature, like nature's like drenched with it. So it's quite a fundamental molecule, really, a common constituent in many things throughout the natural world. And what's particularly interesting about it, in no insignificant way, is that it's endogenous to the human body as well. So, and that has other implications, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah, very interesting. And I'm glad that you mentioned Dennis McKenna, because we have an episode of his in our back catalog, and anyone who is interested in learning more about that guest or any other guests that might be referenced during our conversation today should make sure that they go and look them up, because Dennis, like everyone else, is a fantastic source of information and personal insight. Let's talk a little bit about, though, this particular substance a little bit more. Okay, it's everywhere in the world, it's in my body, but let's say someone says that they wanted to work with DMT. How exactly do they work with it? Do you go to a clinic? Do you just find a DMT molecule in the air somewhere? I don't know. Put it on your tongue. What exactly does it look like in terms of practical usage?
Yeah, well, it's funny you say about like just the air, because in relation to what I said about it being endogenous, I mean, there's no scientific, like, totally verified scientific evidence for it, but the idea of breath work, for instance, getting into these deep states that you can get through different breathwork modalities, and that can be like quite like ancient and to like modern, like Wim Hof stuff. That some people say that potentially that's an endogenous DMT kind of efflux happening.
Interesting.
Yeah, which is possible. I think, yeah. But so in terms of your actual question, it's a psychedelic, so it will depend on, you know, the legalities of where you are in the world. But yeah, for instance, I'm based in the UK, and it's a class A, and there's only experimental research being done. Yeah, but there's some very interesting experimental clinical studies for depression, for instance. Small pharma are doing some stuff, other companies. So it's, and just recently, just the other month, there was some new data showing that there was some significant and sustained reductions in depression using intravenous DMT. So while it's not medicalised now, these could be the first signs of potential medicalisation on the horizon for specific populations and specific disorders.
Gotcha. And so what I'm hearing, speaking to an audience member who may just really have no background in this at all, is that if you were to use DMT, and of course you, Webdelics, me, all of us are not advocating for any sort of use of any substance in violation of the laws of their jurisdiction or in ways that are not accompanied by the appropriate medical or mental health guidance. But to be clear, it's something that likely would be utilized as as an infusion or taken as an infusion, as opposed to, like, let's say a pill or a plant, a DMT plant that you might grow somewhere and then just put into your mouth.
Yeah, exactly, Scott. Yeah, I mean, with DMT, it's not orally active in and of itself, so that's why it would be directly into the bloodstream. Recreationally, it's smoked, but then of course there's the rich history of DMT use indigenously, because it's certainly not something we like invented, and it might be synthesized now for experimental clinical purposes, but it's this natural compound that's been used for potentially millennia, and that could be in the form of a snuff. So in the Amazon, there's snuff powders that will contain and DMT as well as these other related DMT-like chemicals I also mentioned at the start, and that would be insufflated, and they would actually insufflate it kind of in a pair, and it would be blown up the other individual's nose. And then there's ayahuasca, so you certainly would have heard of ayahuasca, and that's a decoction, Amazonian decoction, so it has DMT from, let's say, the Psychotropa viridis plant, and then it would also have monoamine oxidase inhibitors in the form of beta carbolines, these specific molecules in another plant, the ayahuasca vine, Banisteriopsis caapi, for instance, and so that those would be combined, and what that would do is it would make the DMT orally active, because the monoamine oxidase inhibitors would inhibit the monoamine oxidases which are in our gut, which would otherwise denature the DMT.
This is all really fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. Again, this is stuff that can be difficult to understand. It can be overwhelming for folks that are not in the psychedelic world, and breaking it down in that much detail really is illuminating. So that's very, very much appreciated. If I were to have an infusion of DMT, or let's say I decided to go through some sort of therapeutic process that involved DMT infusions, how would that impact my life in a way that was different than those of other psychedelic substances? In other words, what would my experience be like using DMT versus, let's say, a shamanistic journey using psilocybin?
Right. Well, I guess there's the important thing there is to distinguish between the compound itself and the context. So if we did sort of compare like for like. So if you had, let's say, in a clinical setting, DMT compared to a clinical setting, psilocybin. If we're interested in what the molecule itself elicits compared to the two of them. So in terms of like what happens when you're like on DMT and the phenomenology of that, there's a lot to say about that. I've basically got like two and a half whole papers just talking about DMT, like phenomenology in and of itself. But what the first one was focused on, the so-called kind of entity encounter. So this is something which is kind of a pretty reliable trope when it comes to DMT, which is one particular dimension of it which fascinates people, especially. It's not to say that other substances, for instance, like if you to compare it to psilocybin, that doesn't happen under those conditions. It's just with kind of DMT, given its that potency and the way that it's recreationally, or the dosage which is typically used, then it just reliably leads to a sort of so-called kind of breakthrough phenomenon where your world is basically replaced, and there's an emergence into some kind of novel structure of reality, and that may well be populated by certain apparent kind of other agencies, let's say. So that's the kind of core, the kind of bare bones of what this kind of breakthrough DMT experience would look like. But and of course it will also engender experience of core like mystical experience, so sense of dissolution of self, unitivity, like connection to the world and the universe, and transcendence of time and space and these kind of constructs, sense of noetic experience, so feeling that you've kind of gained access to the ground of reality, or like special insight, these kind of things. So that's very core to the kind of peak DMT experience as well. But the interesting thing is that they can seem fundamentally kind of antithetical, like opposed to each other. That there's a more kind of non-dual state of this mystical type experience I related, and then there's a more kind of dualistic relational environment with the kind of idea of going into this other space and meeting these other kind of beings. So and in the way in which the latter especially could kind of manifest would be, essentially infinite. There's just meeting a being, and there's just the idea of going to another place. But what do those beings? What do those places look like? And if I just were to just riff off from some of my own research, because we basically ran the first really field study, sort of kind of naturalistic observational study of just users of DMT, and we gave them measures and interviewed them, etc. So if I were to just riff off some phenomenology we had from that, like we had alien abduction-esque scenarios, and that sort of echoes from Strassman's studies, which he did in the 90s. That was the first psychedelic critical study which sort of precipitated the so-called renaissance in psychedelic research. So these abductive kind of experiences of people with these alien beings trying to communicate, like having this urge to communicate in a highly technological environment, showing things to this individual in a kind of laboratory-esque sort of context, and we had kind of clown-like beings which were robotic in nature, that were like exceptionally playful, and were kind of eliciting the sense of like wanting to play and just engage in like fun, and we had sort of things which weren't necessarily obviously animate, but I mean, in this realm these things are kind of quite blurred, but sort of several individuals actually interestingly described like a hyperdimensional cuboid kind of structure, which was like ferociously like spinning, and with some like synesthetic dimensions to it, but had some very interesting like relations to the sense of self as well in at least one of them. I could go on and on and on, but if you wanted to hear more, you can certainly ask me. But I guess the point is that it's you could describe it in very, very many different like categorical expressions, like very sci-fi-esque, or just bizarre, or just highly unexpected. But I think you can kind of catch my drift with that so far, Scott.
I certainly have caught your drift, and we're going to get into that in a lot more depth in a few minutes. You cannot talk about alien beings or playful clowns coming out of nowhere or these bizarre structures and not expect a sci-fi guy like myself to not want to ask more questions. Oh, hell yeah, I am. So we're going to get to that in a second, but let me just ask, you mentioned in passing earlier that this is a substance that is found to be helpful for those suffering from depression. Talk to me about other people, if there are others, that are the ideal individual that might be interested in learning more about this substance in a non-recreational context.
Well, that's a very big question. I mean, certainly the whole point of the renaissance of psychedelics is that far too many people in this world are suffering, and if we're talking about psychiatrically, their tools are limited, and so it's very, very exciting new kind of brave new world to incorporate these possible new candidates into the psychiatric pharmacopoeia and stuff. But that's in one domain, but it's a very ongoing debate about not just DMT but psychedelics in general, about should they remain just within this container, the structure of medicine and treatment, for those who are patients, because they, and it's often been like referred to as like the idea of psychedelics for the betterment of well people, that these are substances which, if we were to say that we're all suffering in a way, I mean, in fact, like the word suffering is, if you take it from like a Buddhist context, for instance, it's not doesn't purely refer to suffering as in to the experience of pain, but just the idea that we're kind of agents through life, where life happens to us. So we're constantly experiencing life. We undergo, I think is the best word, like life, and a lot of that can involve challenges for anyone who walks this planet. And so these substances, and importantly the fact that they're not just substances, they engender profound alterations and transfigurations in one's consciousness. Like that, that is something that we have been lacking and missing in whatever culture that has illegalized, rendered them illegal now, or in the past have demonized them very differently to previous cultures, ancient cultures, present day indigenous cultures, who are making use of these medicines, as they call it, but interestingly, medicines not just for people who are considered sick, but for anybody, for the community at large. So in a way, they can benefit anybody, but I guess there's a couple of threads I could go with that in terms of what we just spoken about, like in terms of what is it about the phenomenology, this very far out phenomenology of DMT? Why would that even help someone with depression? Why is that even happening experimentally? Do you know what I mean?
I'm actually glad that you raised that, because that was the thread that I wanted to pursue next before we start talking about what happens during these experiences. Talk to us a little bit so that a lay person can understand, to the extent that we know, what is going on in someone's brain if they, let's say, have an infusion of DMT and then begin to have these very far out experiences. And why would that, to the best of our knowledge, from a physiological perspective, change their mental state, like help ease their depression, or I assume help with PTSD or other trauma-related issues that people might have?
So I guess it's still early days to properly disentangle what might DMT do uniquely in the brain of a let's say someone who's depressed, compared to what psilocybin would do. But a key difference there, at least, is the duration and the intensity. So while DMT is going to be much shorter, so it'll be like a kind of a half an hour max experience, but not peak kind of all the way. It's shorter than that, but the kind of broader arc, let's say half an hour. But it'll be exceptionally intense. That peak will be kind of explosively intense with the higher doses, compared to something like psilocybin or even ayahuasca, even though it's the same compound, which is one of the main ingredients. That will be drawn out into many hours. So that brevity, one reason why it might be looked at clinically and there being some interest and investment there is because it helps maybe with the model, the economical model and things. But also it could be helpful, the brevity of it for in terms of the individual patients as well. And the despite the brevity, like an account of the intensity, like it's extremely impressive how there can be, to say the least, how there can be such a transformation in an individual's life, just with a single kind of DMT experience. It's so. But in terms of the neuroscience, the neuroimaging results and things which you were kind of getting at, it being a classical psychedelic, like I said, similarly to psilocybin and others, it dismantles or disintegrates a particular neural network called the default mode network, which you're probably familiar with. That's garnered like a lot of attention because psychedelic neuroimaging is a new science, so that's certainly a reliable feature of how psychedelics manifest their changes in the brain. And that includes DMT. So the default mode network being a certain triangulation of areas in the brain, which could be considered as like the seat of the self. Let's say, like it's responsible for ruminative. Well, that's a more pathological way of saying it, but the prospection into the future, retrospection into the past, like memories, self-referential experiences, mind wandering. It's called the default mode because it's almost like the idle mechanism of the brain. So, but it's not just that which has this kind of effect where the nodes of it are disconnected under the DMT state. Like there's the executive network, so other higher order networks which exist in the cortex, which have been like more laterally evolved. They kind of succumb to this sort of inhibition. And in terms of how that would be psychiatrically alleviative, why that could be, why it's a good candidate for being an antidepressant, for instance, it could well be largely owing to these particular networks where people become depressed in the first instance. There's a certain entrenchment of thought patterns and behaviour which are kind of instantiated in these cortical networks. There's an overlearning and a fusing of the neurocircuitry and the thought patterns associated with them, where your mind becomes narrowed ultimately. And there's some other things I could say, kind of more cognitive science sort of terminology about, which is actually lent from like addiction research about reciprocal narrowing and things like this. But over time, this continual entrenchment of destructive pathological thoughts and behaviours. And what psychedelics do is they can help to dismantle that, to undermine that. And there's another concept that's often introduced about annealing, which is the idea of like metal becoming the manipulation of metal. Once it's heated, the structure becomes more malleable, and the changing of that material. And so you can kind of apply that analogous kind of principles to what's happening in the brain there, where you feel more open, just less imprisoned by these previous like experiences. There's other things about neurogenesis and things like DMT is quite potent. So it's a compound which can generate new synaptic connections in neurons, and even in the first generation, let's say, of antidepressants, that's been shown as being like a key driver, if not the driver, of the antidepressant effect. This generation of new neurons. So that's certainly going to have a contributive effect as well.
Wow, that was so comprehensive, and it contained so much. I may have to recommend that folks listen to it a couple of times just to take it all in and really understand it. But that's what we're about, making sure that we give people information that's comprehensive and that they can rely on and actually absorb. Thank you for that. I have to say, when you're talking about these experiences that disintegrate the ego or the sense of self, or as we mentioned before you got into this part of the discussion, when you have a substance that can trigger people experiencing these very, I hate to use this term because it's so stereotyped, but these sort of far out experiences, and they literally sound far out. That term I used all the time when I was a little boy. I really didn't understand what it meant. And this podcast has gotten me to understand it on a whole different level. It's both fascinating and terrifying. I've been honest about this from the very first episode of this show, Pascal. One of the reasons why psychedelics have interested me is because I suffered from PTSD. I had a very, very difficult childhood. It left me scarred. And I went into therapy for 11 years to deal with that and did EMDR, sometimes twice a week on top of talk therapy to really wrap my mind around this. And one of the things that PTSD did for me, it was a quote unquote gift that I got, as it has been a quote unquote gift for a lot of other people, is heightened fear. Why am I raising that? Because let's say I were depressed, or let's say I were dealing with some other trauma that I want to get better with regards to. I hear something like what you've described, these intense experiences that folks have, but it's both endlessly fascinating and of profound fear trigger. Right? How do people get past that? And I'll just say one other thing before you get into the answer to that, which is, as those who watch this show regularly know, after a number of different episodes, recordings, I made a decision to begin my own journey as a psychonaut. And not that long ago, as of the date of this recording, I went on my first psilocybin journey. It was a guided one with a shaman. And one of the things that I felt at the very beginning of the journey was intense, overwhelming fear. My entire body was shaking, my legs, my pelvis, my arms, even my chest, out of fear, out of terror. Oh my God, what's going to happen here? What if I never get out? What if my mind is fried? What if my family finds out that I'm dead in this place that I'm in right now? I was able to get through that, but the fear that even thinking about a DMT experience with clowns popping out of the woodwork is so overwhelming. I almost don't know what to do with that. Is that something that I should be afraid of?
The fear is important. Despite all of these positive or like auspicious findings for psychedelics for many things, not just like diagnoses, it's despite that, there's a real push now, an encouragement to talk more about the challenging experiences that people have, and this might be from experiences which aren't even overtly, like in the content of them, like difficult if you were to hear them, like even like the mystical experience, for instance, like this sense of the dissolution of one's sense of self, like that can be frightening to hear about, to experience, and I think with this kind of phenomenology that we have with DMT, it's especially peculiar, and not just with DMT, ultimately with all psychedelics. That is what's so different and ultimately special about them, is that they basically bring about metaphysical experiences. Which is a fascinating term, just two words to put together in and of itself, because metaphysics is the domain of philosophy. It's an arena of the intellect, of considering and just having discourse about the nature of the universe. But you can have an experience of that, and you can have an experience of that with the use of these substances quite reliably. That's basically what the mystical experience is. It's a metaphysical one, because it's an encounter with the world in a fundamentally different way to the everyday, where we're talking about communion with quote unquote God, for instance, about the escape of the structures of time and space. At least in the perceived phenomenology of it, we don't know if this is happening or not necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
So this can be this is very, 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 that can lead to challenging experiences, what's so called like ontological shock, if you're not prepared for it. So this is kind of back to your question as to like what can one do when trying to approach that sense of fear. And I mean, actually, to shout out again to our friend Lee, student of mine, and he's recently submitted a really, really wonderful essay, and he's very passionate about this subject. So he spoke about it at length, and part of his passion of what he wanted to express was how to prepare and potentially integrate, especially an emphasis on preparation for these things, with recourse to ancient wisdom traditions and religion, because they've grappled with these experiences forever, and they've developed whole cosmologies and specific rituals and technique to not just like guide you through the experience, but to root yourself in beforehand. If I were to remember some things which he was writing about, which I really particularly liked, like the idea of there's a Kabbalistic as well as a Tibetan Buddhist concept of like untying the knot, which I really cottoned onto, because that's essentially what you're doing in these deep order states, like especially if we're talking about psychedelic states, like as I was talking about before, about like annealing, and the brain is essentially one big knot, essentially, but it can get knotted up in especially kind of hellish ways, really, and this is what I was referring to again with like reciprocal narrowing as an idea, and if the goal of entering into these metaphysical states, like including with psychedelics, is to unravel those for the purpose of your own like freedom and like liberation, then you can kind of mirror that beforehand in a preparative state, and do whatever those Kabbalistic or Tibetan Buddhist practices would be in order to get into an echoing state of that, to kind of set you up well for the experience itself. Again, I could talk a lot about this, but just to wrap up on that, with Peter Hughes, for instance, he's a philosopher at Exeter. He has written a really beautiful paper recently called "On the Need for Metaphysics in Psychedelic Therapy." But his kind of emphasis was on the integration experience. So people come in and they have this experience, and their metaphysical marbles are blown, to borrow a term from another one of my students, Emma. There you go, accreditation. So they have this experience, and then what? They're people who are totally naive to not just psychedelics potentially, but these kinds of experiences, maybe even the concepts of them. It's everyday people who are suffering that want kind of some kind of healing, and so Peter was kind of advocating for this idea of using a metaphysical menu in the integration therapy sessions, where there would be literally what he's developed is a matrix of the major metaphysical models, like what is the universe, and its relationship to like us and consciousness. Is it a totally monistic thing? It would be like materialism, so everything's matter. Idealism, everything is mind. Panpsychism, consciousness is a fundamental principle of the universe. Dualism, there's a fundamental disconnection between two different substances, matter and mind. All of these things, which people are essentially going to come up against in their experience in some manifestation or other, for them to understand it and make sense of it. So he's calling for people to experiment with, to see if that actually does help in a therapeutic context. I think that it's potentially important to prepare people in a similar way, because there's another massive question when it comes to psychedelics in the clinic, is consent and the ethics problem, because how can you properly give consent as a participant or patient to having this medicine, this experience, if you have no reference point at all for what this experience could engender in you. So at least having some kind of nuanced, comprehensive like discussion and therapeutically like beforehand would be important for consent. But also, I mean, that's as far as you can go. You can't exactly give them the experience so as that they can have an understanding, because that itself would require their own consent in an infinite regress. But I digress. It's also important for the idea of for priming, and there might be some priming effects which can potentially be like good or bad potentially, depending on their reaction to these concepts. But it's basically all about like the minimization of harm and the maximization of healing, really. So if that can be useful like before the experience to help set them up for the navigation of the experience, then that's important to consider.
Well, and you really are raising an interesting point that actually I have to even raise on a personal level, and the personal is always what really this boils down to. We only care about the stuff to the extent that it can impact our personal lives. When I went on this recent journey, looking back on it, and even as it began, I realized how appropriate the word journey was for what I went through. I literally went on a journey with a built-in story arc. Now, it so happens that a subject that has interested me, I would even say fascinated me, and has spoken to me very profoundly ever since I was 9 years old, has been mythology. And in fact, I've always found a way to bring myths into speeches or presentations or drawings when I was younger. Even public speaking that I do now, I reference Greek myths in particular with a huge amount of frequency. And so I'm someone that was walking into the experience with an understanding of myth, and even as I was going through the journey, was recognizing this is a myth. This is mythic imagery. This is a mythic arc. This is a mythic experience. And so I was super advantaged looking back on it in terms of understanding this and being able to integrate it because the language came naturally to me. And I say that explicitly because you did mention myth earlier in your conversation, and this comes up again and again and again. The reason why I say there's a little bit of unfairness about this is how many people are out there spending their free time studying Greek myths, right, or mythology generally. Yes, there are a fair amount of people that do that, but your average Jane or Joe Doe might not understand this, or they might not have a background in metaphysics, or they might not have any number of other things that could help them comprehend exactly what they're consenting to if they were to consent to this, except, like you said, they could be consenting to literally anything and both within and outside of the universe happening to them, which is a very broad consent. I have to say, as a recovering attorney, spent many years looking at consent forms. Oh, right. like, what do you even say to that sort of consent? But then it also raises another issue that you've touched on, but I want us to dive into a lot more deeply right now, which is not only the raw interpretation of these experiences, but really whether they are in the brain or not. When we were prepping for this call, I told you about an experience, and I've referenced it a couple of times in this podcast, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail now because I think it's truly relevant to this discussion. In the summer of 2023, I unexpectedly and suddenly came down with a horrible, later found out that it was life-threatening illness. People in the audience who may be listening or watching, or if they get concerned, it was an infection of some sort that has since passed, and I don't have any more of that infection. But no one knows what that infection was, and it was a rapid onset and very extreme pylons of symptoms. One of the symptoms was that I started sleeping a lot. And when I was sleeping one night for 20 hours, I had this dream. And in this dream, I was walking through a bunch of mansions that had floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and I kept pulling baseball cards out of these bookshelves, and every last baseball card said the same thing in bold letters: your number is up. And it had my photograph. Now, that is a screwed up, crazy, scary dream. And it's perhaps not coincidental that the next morning I couldn't walk and had to be rushed into the emergency room.
So your condition worsened after that, did it? Like, in terms of you not even being able to
worsened
walk?
dramatically. Yeah, like literally when I woke up the next morning. And what happened during that hospital stay at one point was that the doctor said, and by the way, when I was there initially, it was not clear that I would make it out. In fact, I just spoke to a client yesterday who came and visited me while I was there, and he said when he saw me, he wasn't sure that he'd ever see me again. Wow. Very disturbing to hear, and it was very disturbing to experience. And I remember telling a doctor about this dream, and I said, I think I'm going to die. I think that that's what my numbers up meant. Now, I think it actually really meant something else. It obviously didn't mean that I was going to die because I'm alive and well. But why am I telling you all of this? Because it was like I had entered another world. This was not, as we mentioned in our pre-discussion, this was not just some ordinary dream. I understand the difference between dreams and reality. This felt like I was living it, and I remember it as a memory, not a memory of a dream. And the way dreams, when you have dreams, they sort of become wispier and wispier the further away you are from them. This, I remember, just like I remember 9/11, like it was yesterday. And so I have to wonder, well, was I really in another place? This dream was predicting something that was about to happen. It ended up actually not being something physical, although it partially was, but it was really predicting spiritual or emotional or psychological changes that I needed to make, that I have since made since it's occurred. I tie all of this back into what you're saying. These experiences that people have with aliens or bizarre technologies or clowns coming in, there's a consistency, as I'm understanding, in what you're saying that people see. And they're remembering them in this way that sounds very vivid, not just sort of going into the ether like a nightmare. And I then do have to ask, what do we think is really going on? Is this stuff somehow communication? Are we having some filter that our brain puts in with the universe around us removed? And what is thinking about the implications of that? Yeah, I know I said a lot. Take a deep breath and say what you need to for as long as you need to, because I just threw a ton of bricks at you. I don't expect you to just...
Well, no, I mean...
to just sit back and take it.
I was somewhat ready for the experience of your dream, because you mentioned this to me before. It's just the question of, what does that, and what do the DMT experiences, what do some of the near-death experiences, which is essentially the kind of thing that you experience, what does that all mean? What does that imply for these metaphysical questions of like consciousness and like as you alluded to earlier, like is it all in the brain or is it not? Those are the hard questions. I mean, literally, it's called the hard problem. David Chalmers popularized like the hard problem of consciousness is where does it come from, and how does it come from wherever it comes from? So how does, if consciousness comes from the brain, how does that happen? So how do these experiences hinge on that? There's the possibility. I mean, I'm quite kind of tempted to just look at your dream and all of its different manifestations and deconstruct it and stuff like we did last time. But we don't know the exact condition that you were in. Like, we don't have the exact technical medical reports and stuff to see how proximal to death you were, if your brain at any point. Well, it seems from what you're saying, like you weren't actually considered clinically like dead at any point.
Right.
But you were still in a very,
not.
very physiologically like dire space. So the kind of classical near-death experience would be defined as you being in an actually life-threatening condition. You may not have actually been clinically dead for any point, or your vitals being ablated for whatever time. Like so in a way, like maybe we could safely say that what you did experience is actually a near-death experience. Like there'll be others that will kind of have more caveated like criteria, like the phenomenology itself would have to align to certain experiences in order to be considered a near-death experience. Like if you were to take a particular questionnaire, the near-death experience questionnaire, there's a more recent kind of updated version. If you score above a certain threshold, I can send it to you, and maybe we can liaise after, like whether or not according to that you actually had a near-death experience. And I think it's very possible actually that you did. So the question perennially has always been like, well, if people are in such a situation that their brain is so compromised, and yet they're still having, and in some cases it will be surrounding a time of like actual clinical death where there's no heartbeat, and only 30 seconds later there's essentially no higher cortical activity, although there may be some ongoing like residual activity for some minutes. So with all of that, there's an irony or a paradox that how can you still have a very deep, vivid, lucid, hyper complex experience that we can consider as like the near-death experience, and that's led a lot of people to kind of put their money on a non or like a post-materialist paradigm of things, that actually the consciousness isn't dependent on the brain after all, because look at these experiences. There's so as I kind of alluded to, like there's still some possible residual activity. So there's lots of studies now coming out about at the point of death, not just with like rats and other animal models, but even with humans, with like there's a recent interesting one of a person who spontaneously passed away as he was undergoing like clinical EEG, so they're recording his brain on the scalp, his cortical electrical activity, and again this data like mirrored what we've seen in other human studies of people having life support withdrawn when they had more basic kind of EEG arrays on them, and what we see in like rat studies where there's quite like sophisticated like high resolution EEG on them, and they sacrifice the rats, and the activity, not to get into like the very technical nuances of the differences, but ultimately there's a surge of activity. And that basically happens in these situations where there is ultimate death, like different to yourself and other near-death experiences,
right,
where you don't obviously have irreversible death. In these other conditions, they do, and that surge happens just before a final total, like what's called isoelectric EEG, like total like flatline of the brain, which eventually will signal like irreversible brain death, basically. So there's this argument that accounts for it. There we have it. Like that's where the near-death experience comes from, and we can subsume it under a neuroscientific lens and everything. It's certainly compelling, and it may well be the case. But who knows? I mean, there's lots of, and again, like you said, I could go on and on, but there's anomalous features, and although I come from this interest in the neuroscience, I'm also deeply interested in parapsychological or other anomalous experiences, hence my interest in near-death experiences. But there's even certain features like this within the near-death experience which cause many schools of people to question whether or not it can actually all be explained in a neuroscientific manner, like effects of there's kind of main, I guess the main one where lots of research attention has gone into is veridical out-of-body experiences. So people having a heart attack, feel, you know, their perceptions, they kind of pop out their body, see themselves there, and they float around, and they think to themselves, wow, I just died. And then ensues the whole kind of journey of a near-death experience if it goes into those deeper kind of dimensions of it. Often, I mean, the most common experiences of a near-death experience are these, let's say, like shallower. I mean, I'm not putting them on any hierarchical kind of level, but the ones which are most common are like this out-of-body experience, feeling a sense of peace, there being like a kind of dilation of time, and maybe you'll meet deceased loved ones as well. So if they accurately report what's going on, that is very compelling. And there's scores of like instances of this, and some of them are less reliable than others. But there's ones where they might be in an operation theatre and they have their eyes and ears, as they are routinely, like closed and plugged, and they're anaesthetised before, you know, going into the operating room, and yet they can very accurately report what had happened at a time when they coded, you know, when they had a cardiac arrest or when they lost all their blood or whatever. And I think, and please do stop me if I just keep rambling, but there's a possibility that, and this is basically what my doctorate was really about, was about near-death experiences and psychedelics, and maybe if they're extremely similar, then there's some endogenous psychedelic activity at the point of death. And in these cases of maybe the more compelling OBEs, where they're anaesthetised in that situation I just described, there's the concept of entropy in the brain. So the anaesthesia puts the brain in a certain condition which minimises certain like activity indices of the brain, like what's called complexity in the brain, which is kind of related to this idea of entropy. But not to worry too much about that. It's just like there's a reduction in these indices, and then there's an ablation of consciousness. But psychedelics actually are very well known to increase these measures in the brain, like entropy. And entropy is basically just a proxy of like chaos in the system, like uncertainty, diversity of activity in the brain. So any increase of psychedelics endogenously could overcome the threshold of anesthesia and could lead to awareness in those like contexts in an operation theatre, for instance. But if your eyes and ears are plugged and you have no previous understanding of the setting because you weren't there at the time, like you weren't conscious as you were wheeled in, let's say, and yet you're still reporting these accurate things, that's actually very fascinating. And it implies that maybe it's not just these states of like near-death experiences, but even in psychedelic states, there are these other anomalous features because of hitherto unexplained ways that they work in the brain. Consciousness is changed such that there's maybe some non-local kind of capacities that are kind of evidenced, possibly.
Well, and that's ultimately why I wanted to raise the dream that I had, and why the subject of near-death experiences, which I'm glad you brought into the room, seems like it's relevant. The awareness or this feel that this is something beyond the day-to-day, that somehow a threshold has been crossed, seems to be at least somewhat common when you think through how did I describe that dream? How do people describe near-death experiences? Even how do the metaphysical portions of psychedelic experiences, even the one I had, how can those be described? How can those be felt? And is there a commonality behind them? And so this raises a deeper question to me. We have DMT experiences and other psychedelic ones as well. And we have the near-death experiences, and then we have these near-death experiences, like what I may well have gone through, right? And then maybe it goes out from there. They all have these components in common. But two of them are without the involvement of a substance to our knowledge. One of them is. They all have something else in common that we haven't really touched on directly, but is underlying all of them, which is a profound personal, I would even argue spiritual transformation. This dream, no joke, it changed my life. It's hard for me to even talk to you about it right now without getting emotional. And then when you hear about near-death experiences, people don't just say, oh, it happened, then I went back and got my nails done the next day and everything was cool, right? That ain't how people talk about it. They say it changed their life, whether it gave them meaning or they were disturbed about it for years afterwards. And then psychedelic experiences, these DMT experiences that we are focusing right now, you're saying that they had a transformational experience on people's lives with regards to mental health. But one thing that's come up over and over again has been with regards to the spirituality of those that engage to them. That's impacted too. So I ask you, and this may not be a question you can answer, so okay, sass back at me, clap back at me on my own show, Pascal, but are these really drugs? What? Because drugs, when I think of drugs, leaving aside the common term, but when I think of drugs in a medicinal sense, I think of something that adjusts the body, not necessarily transforming the spirit.
Yeah. You word it quite well. I mean, they're not just drugs in a way. They're kind of unprecedented, even amongst the kind of cornucopia of psychoactive substances, like psychedelics, are different. I mean, they're kind of colloquially called like all-rounders. There's like uppers and there's downers, and then there's all-rounders. And that, in a colloquial kind of funny way, like speaks to how they do act on the brain in a very fundamental way. And they could be considered like a nexus of like to use the language poetically, not necessarily subscribing to any sort of metaphysics, but like the material and the transcendent or spiritual or whatever, because they are undoubtedly drugs, because they are. I mean, that's the definition of a drug is a pharmacological substance, so a molecule which changes the physiology of the body, including the nervous system. And in terms of psychoactive drugs, that will include the nervous system in such a way that there are changes in the mind, because there's this inextricable relationship that we've yet to explicate, the brain and the mind. But I think, it's sort of very interesting stuff, because I think the actual crux of what even we're talking about when we talk about spirituality is consciousness. It's all about consciousness, because it all comes back to consciousness. So in a way, consciousness is like intrinsically spiritual, actually, and we're ensnared all the time in our default mode, like say in an egoic, normative, like waking consciousness, and that's this. We can be considered as like monophasic cultures where we're locked into and habituated to a single mode of being, and we don't even know that there's other ways of being. And then suddenly, whatever altered state it is, doesn't have to be psychedelic, even if it's a mild one, there's a change in that lens of enacting like in the world, and then you feel your own consciousness differently, and that, I think, interestingly, I think that minor change can almost ubiquitously be referred to as some kind of spiritual phenomenon. And then there's a whole spectrum, and you get into like, let's say, a peak psychedelic or like DMT state, and it's just very undeniably, like overwhelmingly of a metaphysical, like sort of spiritual nature, like in terms of the experience. So yeah, they're not just drugs, I suppose, and therefore they're not like just to be trifled with. Like if you talk to Jung, for instance, like psychedelic community loves to talk about Jung, but interestingly, he, because his thoughts and theories are actually very well dovetailing with like psychedelic phenomenology and stuff, but he would say he would be quite contra the idea of the usage of psychedelics. He would say things like, beware of unearned wisdom, and that you're kind of opening up Pandora's box, that you can have enough of an access to the collective unconscious just through your own, let's say, endogenous states like dreaming and things like that. But the beware of unearned wisdom to me is particularly interesting, because it usually has a kind of valence about a kind of moral judgment, like you haven't earned it. Yeah. And you could interpret it that way, and that can be helpful. But I have reconsidered it almost with a kind of neuroscientific lens, as I'm kind of apt to do, where what you're doing when you ingest a psychedelic is you're taking over the brain in a way which it hasn't learnt throughout its developmental lifespan. So it's living in certain ingrained patterns and motifs, like in the brain, this is throughout your whole life, and then suddenly you incorporate psychedelic into the mix. And in terms of what we were saying before about psychedelics kind of increasing entropy and like disconnecting these high networks, and that then lends itself to a hyper-connected state of the brain. So there's like a what's referred to as like a desegregation of networks in the brain, which means like the brain is communicating with itself in a kind of unprecedented way, in a very rich way. And so this is just a new way I've considered Jung's statement on like beware of unearned wisdom, because there can be this potential for overwhelm of excessive insight, what sometimes referred to as like Gnostic potential and things, in a way that your brain actually hasn't developed the proper structural foundations to even deal with. So that's just sort of harkens back to the risks that are associated with it. But I think it's always a debate, because the same metaphysical experience that you can have can lead one to like ontological shock, as we've discussed, or it can lead to, and I suppose it's fair to say, like more often than not, when the situation is held sufficiently enough, will lead to positive transformation, because it's a mystical experience. It's one of utter like connection and loss of your sense of self, which was the harbinger of all of this like shit in your mind, and connection to something sacred that's beyond yourself, and the noetic potential there of feeling like you're suddenly aware of something that you weren't before, which is illuminative and opens you up, and all of this is the deep potential for forms of healing, but it's sort of there's sort of a bit of a it can kind of go either way, but this idea of it being a spiritual experience, and I think you alluded to spiritual beliefs and how it can change that. There's a couple of studies recently sort of demonstrating that psychedelics will change your metaphysical beliefs. They'll make you more likely to, and this is kind of anecdotally very well understood, but it's nice to have empirical data and showing like the the fine grained nature of it. Like, you're more likely to be or subscribe to panpsychic views about the universe being like having consciousness as some kind of fundamental component to it, and maybe you're more also likely to attribute consciousness to things you previously considered inanimate. So they're kind of similar things actually, and that itself was correlated to increased well-being. So that's really interesting, and this mirrors again with the near-death experience. Like, one of the fun, other than like total lessening of fear of death, is the sense of being far more likely to consider the universe in a spiritual way than you were before, which may well be like intrinsically related to you feeling better than you did before. I mean, it can be very challenging in and of itself, and there needs to be integrative support and things that if you do have that, then these experiences can actually lead to better change.
There's two issues that I want to delve into that you just raised. I'll say the juicier one, or at least what I think is juicier, for the second one in a minute. But I also have to ask, if you're saying that there's beginning to be empirical evidence that people who go through these experiences are more likely to ascribe to a certain set of spiritual or metaphysical beliefs, one could argue that actually that's a risk. You might get better from a well-being perspective, but you may have given, depending on what you believed beforehand or what those in your community believe or are willing to accept, have given up something very profound. Like let's say you grew up in a community like I did, fundamentalist Christian area of the United States, where the belief in a lot of these things that you're talking about are associated with demonism. And in order to fit into your community, or at least if you're willing to accept all beliefs as having equal validity, again, which is itself a whole other podcast series worth of ethical and philosophical issues. But let's leave those aside, right? You are potentially at risk of falling outside of community standards while bettering yourself. That's just point number one that I want to make, and by all means feel free to respond to it, but I have to get to what I think might be the even juicier one, which is that, and Pascal, I never dreamed in my life, I have to again keep it real, that I would be sitting on a podcast like this, having a discussion in which I'm about to say what I'm about to say. What have you taken my world into, Pascal Michael? I blame you for it all. How about that for ego dissolution? Well, wisdom itself, unearned wisdom. You know, I think about concepts like personality disorder. As I understand personality disorder, they represent a lack of wisdom. You go through and engage in the world in a limited with a limited series of reactions to the circumstances that you face. Let's say you have a narcissistic personality disorder or something like that. As I understand it, you're still responding the same way over and over again. You're not able to grow and develop out of it, which is why people say those with some of these personality disorders are never truly, or only rarely truly able to change. Again, I'm not at any sort of field expert on this, but you hear this, at least in popular culture, over and over. They represent a lack of wisdom, which is, to my eyes and to my heart, the integration of, as kind of as you put it, of experiences into knowledge that broadens and widens and has more depth about how one deals with the world. Even if it's not earned, so what? Right, like, who cares if it's under? I mean, I understand what he's saying, and who am I to question you? Young. I mean, seriously, who am I? But I understand all this about opening Pandora's box, but it seems to me like the problem that we're facing, and that a lot of folks might be facing, at least I would have faced with my PTSD when I had it, I wasn't able to access the wisdom on my own to change my behaviors. So what if I had taken DMT at the time and been able to get unearned wisdom? Heck, I needed it. Those in my life were suffering because of my lack of earned wisdom. Why should the world, why should my poor spouse have had to endure 11 years of my unearned wisdom when he could have just gotten it in a day? Okay, I've just said all this. You've got to have something to say.
Yes, no, again, thank you. So I love that you're bringing all the... This is where the richness is, isn't it? Like, you can get lost in all the intellectual, like, you know, rubbish, but you can... But this is the reality of things, so thank you, I think with the unearned wisdom thing, like, you know, who knows exactly where Jung was coming from with it, but at least my interpretation of things is that it's it's just because it's unearned, there's a potential that it could derail as opposed to heal. But I wouldn't put like a value judgment on that to say that just because you haven't earned it means that you don't like deserve it, or that it's a more moral, or it's a more worthy or right way to go about it, to do all the work yourself. I wouldn't necessarily say that, because you know there are plenty of examples, and these, you know, you could say, like, for instance, the first wave of the patient population that were used for these experimental studies of psychedelics were like intractable depression. Like, this is like decades of depression where no treatment worked, you know, be that pharmacological or psychotherapeutic or whatever. So presumably a lot of them put in like a shitload of work, and it still did fuck all. You know, it's just like, pardon my French, but it's and hence, you know, these are the population of people that represent many populations of people, you know, in different situations where there has been a lot of work, and the suffering is kind of unrelenting, and the work might be on their part, might be on others helping them, and so I think, yeah, as you put it, like, beautifully yourself, like, who the fuck cares if it's like on earn, quote unquote. Because ultimately I think it's actually there is a sort of a risk of spiritual bypassing with these psychedelics, because and maybe like some more than others as well, where you can really be in these dire straits, and you can really want to change and turn to these things as novel things that you've maybe never thought that you'd approach before, and you'd have this mind-blowing experience, metaphysical type experience, like ego loss experience, and then you can come back from it, and you can be a better person. And yeah, there may well be extra like work in the road and things, but you feel that there's been some transformation. But the spiritual bypassing thing there is where that you kind of you put the transpersonal at precedence over the kind of the nitty gritty, the bare brass of like human experience, and the shadow and the interpersonal kind of relationship. So that's sort of sacrificed with this like obsession with the spiritual, and so that's a risk. But other than that, like the experience itself from these psychedelics can be like tremendously difficult. I mean, if you were referencing mythology before, and there's the idea of like the hero's journey, you know, these like totally ubiquitous like archetypes, and the descent into the underworld, and the ascent, the kind of the shamanic death and rebirth motif, and that death, this descent into the underworld, like, is this confrontation with shadow, and it might not just be your own shadow, it could be like communal shadow. And remind me, we need to get back to that idea about community as well. I don't want to forget that. That could be harrowing. I mean, like when in certain doctrines, like the Christ during his death and before his resurrection, that was referred to as like the harrowing of hell, where he went into, and that was ultimately the shamanic trope of him. It was a sort of a soul retrieval sort of experience where he, in the Christian theology of things, he saved the souls of those, then offered them salvation. But the point being that it's it might be unearned, but it's for many people it will be a extremely courageous thing to do, you can, when you're at that level, you can end your life. And this is potentially like an alternative where instead of killing yourself, you kill your ego, and you enter into this state which might require like a great deal of bravery, not knowing what's going to happen. And so this is the deep descent that can still be there, which needs to be respected. And then this ascent, like there's this concept of anagoge, which is it's a thing in like spiritual exegeses where there's like allusions to this kind of ascent into the afterlife, but it can also be considered ascent in a sense of like work one's way through into higher states of consciousness, and that's quite a it's a cross-cultural trope as well. So yeah, it's not easy work. Some people might conceptualize it as you took a drug, where you could have done all these other harder work, but actually in some traditions it's called the work. Like in the Santo Daime, for instance, they refer to the Santo Daime as like ayahuasca using syncretic, like Christian tradition, and they refer to it as the work, el trabajo, traballo.
Is it possible, based on any information that we have, empirical or even anecdotal, just be clear as to what it is, that someone, when they experience particularly either this complete ego dissolution or entities during their DMT journeys, are themselves traumatized by the experience and end up worse? I'll say where I'm coming from. There's a part of me, again, like I mentioned earlier, I'm a sci-fi guy, I'm a myth guy, I'm someone that generally likes excitement, new things, especially things that are cool. Aliens, weird spinning shapes, bizarre clowns, all of that to me is cool. Right, like please don't treat me like a cobra and start playing the flute, because I'll rise predictably. But again, like I mentioned, it's also vaguely scary. Is it possible that I would go into this and be so frightened? I'm obsessing with these clowns. I don't know why, but for so frightened by these clowns that I end up worse off. Or is that just really part of the journey, that you go and you have this heightened experience and you face whatever it is, and then you are hopefully, and you've made it clear, not in all cases, but in many cases, much better?
No, I mean, you people. This is what I mean about the importance of more research on the challenging experiences and the after effects thereof, because it's been very important with the psychedelic renaissance, and because to be careful to get psychedelics kind of off the ground, to get some funding in there, to get like medical interest, just because we need them as at least experimental treatments in our burgeoning like pharmacopoeia like now, and who knows where the evidence will lead. Like maybe it will be a complex final kind of outcome, but there's just been this idea of maybe some the early stages of this research, there's some precariousness, because so we didn't want to over-emphasize, let's say, or I say we, like the field long before I was around, they didn't want to over-emphasize these difficult experiences, because they knew there was some knowledge that there was potential in them, so didn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing. So but yeah, I mean, there's definite I wanted to talk about Jules Evans, actually. He's a philosopher, because he's linked with your kind of ND experience that you had as well, and so he is leading, along with colleagues at my uni, at the University of Greenwich, including myself, the Challenging Experiences survey. So it's a very, very big study of just people being surveyed, but also interviewed about difficult experiences and after effects, kind of basically negative impacts that their psychedelic experiences have had on them. there's plenty of people that this has happened to. And of course we can get into the whole thing about setting, and the point of it being incorporated in a clinical setting is that you have a very well curated setting of preparation, integration, therapists, etc., to minimise the potential of that happening. And maybe a lot of these challenging experiences were due to less than desirable kind of attributes of setting and things like that. But not always. I've certainly had experiences myself, where I've had, seemingly the setting seems to be pretty auspicious, and still had pretty harrowing experiences, which might have had, lasting, kind of harmful things, which I'm still basically navigating. And that's not uncommon for many people. So when we're talking about DMT, there's, because of the, let's say, just like the striking phenomenology of it, it's not going to be alien to many people, in an ironic use of that word. There's a lot to grapple with if you have those types of experiences, and if there's a kind of DMT sort of, this is why there's the importance of certain containers for it, be it a medical one or a religious one or whatever, because there's a certain sort of subcultural fixation with like these entities, and like the kind of this noetic idea is being referred to like Chris Timmerman as like epiphany porn, or I like to refer to it as
epiphany porn. I kind of love it.
I refer to it as like I've forgotten what I even call it now. Gnostic narcotic, where they think.
I love it too. I love that Gnostic narcotic. Okay, I have to say that over and over again. Gnostic narcotic. Gnostic narcotic. Okay, I'm going to let you finish. Please forgive me for interrupting. I just had to.
Well, just that like sense of like knowing the answers to the universe, like that can be kind of addictive, and it can get people into metaphysical rabbit holes, which can, in some instances, lead to like psychotic manifestations if it's not, tempered.
As we move to concluding this conversation, one of the things that I have taken away from all of this is that our understanding of these substances, we know from just having had the conversations that we've had on this podcast, are at their very beginnings. But the sheer depth of things to learn about them, the breadth and their implications, are beyond what I could have imagined. I actually would love to be someone that's living 150 years in the future, listen to this episode or watch it and think about everything that has been learned on this topic since. If there was a last takeaway that you would have, or something else that you'd like to share before we get to where people can find out more about you, what would that be, Pascal?
Well, I was just interested in what you were saying before about how these metaphysical experiences can even if they're very, on the surface very positive, and like people feel connected to the divine and believe in spiritual reality, that can actually divorce them from their own community, and that can itself have its own difficulties, and that's really important. And this is another thing when it comes to consent and ethics, when bringing people into these kind of experiences. Where it's not only like having them understand what the experience might be like, but how they might be changed. Like, yes, their depression, or yes, their anxiety, that might be alleviated in some way, but what the other ways in which they can change. Their political like associations might change. Like their something as like seemingly pivotal and profound as like their religious and spiritual inclinations, they might change from. Usually to a more spiritual manner, like if they're somewhat religious beforehand or totally atheistic beforehand, and like we've discussed a lot, like that could be the key to their healing, or it could actually undermine it all. But the thing about community is like very, very important, because the last thing usually these psychedelics they connect people. They like have this tendency of connecting you to yourself, to others, and the broader world, and that is a adhesive for community. And there's again, it's a very well understood thing and just normal human experience, but you know, it's great to have empirical corroboration of this stuff, that it is the social network and the integrity and richness of that which is predictive of so many like indices of health and well-being, and that may be a very key way of how psychedelics are therapeutic in the first place. They connect, you know, you're better because you link better with the world and other people and beings and the natural world. So there's that needs to be like highlighted, but I am intrigued by this thing about it could change community in a different way. Like for instance, people who have near-death experiences, there's a kind of higher rate of divorce than in the general population, because you're no longer seeing the world through the same lens as you did before with the community, you know, the particular social group that shared your lens with you beforehand, and that can be very difficult and will be a central thing that you'll have to negotiate in your integration process. But I guess the hopeful thing about that is that it really is all about integration. Like, how do you reconcile these out there experiences with the everyday, like the vertical with the horizontal, and through that, you know, your community may have to change, but if you do that, then you know, you may well be all the better for it, and including the people around you.
So, Pascal, how can people find out more about you? Where can they go? I cannot imagine that people have listened to or watched this episode and said, I need me some more Pascal Michael. So give the people what they want.
I wish I had like I need to set up a website or something, some kind of centralized thing, but you can get me on, like, if you want to actually, you know, chat, you can get me on my university email at p.i.m.michael at greenwich.ac.uk, or like my Instagram. I mean, if you were to search just Pascal Michael, University of Greenwich, then you'll get lots of research on ResearchGate, for instance. Like, that's where my papers will be, or academia.edu, but also just in a more kind of friendly way, my Instagram, which is Darkertype. So it's basically archetype, but it's spelled with dark, as in D-A-R-K, and then a 3 instead of the E on the end.
This has been an unbelievable conversation. For those of you who are listening or watching, if you have enjoyed this episode, hold on tight, because we have a lot more detailed, deep conversations coming up about specific substances so that you can know, understand, and apply the knowledge from this podcast into your own life and into the lives of those that you love. And in addition, if, as I suspect, you love this podcast more generally, be sure to tell everyone that you know about it. We want to get the word out there. And then take some time to subscribe to our channel on YouTube, or to follow us on our various social media platforms, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook. And then also leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, or leave some wonderful, thoughtful remarks about what you've heard or watched on our YouTube channel. We love hearing from people and connecting with folks. Finally, make sure that you go to our website at webdelics.com. That's webdelics.com for trusted, credible, reliable information on psychedelics and plant medicine. And don't hesitate to subscribe to our blog, because it is pretty doggone good. Above all else, make sure you come back again next time for another episode of the Webdelics podcast.